President Bush, recognizing that having gone to war over some nuclear weapons that did not exist in Iraq, he did not have the ability to go launch another military attack against a country that really was trying to build nuclear weapons, Iran. So a group of generals and intelligence officials showed up in the Oval Office one day. Mr. President, we think we may have a way of slowing down the Iranian program without actually having to bomb them. And better yet, if it works, it'll keep the Israelis from bombing them as well, which was the largest American fear at the time, that Israel would go in and conduct a military strike and the U.S. would, within a week or two, get sucked into yet another war in the Middle East. The way they explained this, you could get some code into the computers that controlled the giant centrifuges that spin at supersonic speeds and make them basically go wobbly, speed them up and slow them down until they so began to go out of whack that they would blow up. And the theory was that if you did it subtly enough, the Iranians would not know whether this was because they had made a mistake in manufacturing, because their engineers were bad, because they had some other kind of internal problem, or because someone was messing with them. And it actually worked for a few years. First, the United States, the president's direction, President Bush's direction, went off and tested this. We had a bunch of centrifuges that looked just like this that we had gotten courtesy of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya when he turned over his nuclear program. A group of generals went down to the nuclear labs in Tennessee, said, we're going to borrow your centrifuges, don't really expect to get them back. They built a model of the Natanz plant in a hillside in Tennessee secretly, and then they started bombarding it with code. And sure enough, these things began to blow up. They took the shards of it, they put them on an airplane, they flew them to Washington, they drove them in the northwest gate of the White House, dumped them out over the Situation Room conference table, and invited the president down to see what the first cyber weapon executed by the United States would actually have done. At that point, the U.S. began the most sophisticated cyber attack that one state had ever started on another. And President Obama inherited this when he came in 2009. He had never really thought about offensive cyber very much. But as he began to take it on, he got to the point where he was going down in the Situation Room and actually opening up this giant diagram of all of the centrifuges at Natanz and picking out sections that they were going to attack the way Lyndon Johnson used to go pick out bombing targets in Vietnam. Just think about that. Here we had a president so wrapped up in a cyber weapon that months before he didn't even know existed, that he was picking targets. He also had a big concern. His worry was that once it came out that we were using cyber weapons like this, every other country that was interested in attacking us or already trying to attack us would use this as an excuse to go off and do just that. And the perfect weapon picks up the story when we had a post-Stuxnet world. Cyber has become the primary way that countries seek to undercut and influence each other with short-of-war operations. And short of war is the key element here. No one's dumb enough to take on the United States in a direct military conflict. The Russians clearly don't want to do that. The Chinese don't want to go do that. Certainly not the North Koreans or the Iranians. And this is what makes cyber the perfect weapon. It's hard to detect. It's extremely hard to figure out where it came from. We have a permanent state of low-level cyber conflict underway, and the prospect of a much larger cyber conflict, because every major country, including us, have changed all of their war planning so that a conflict would start with a cyber attack. You'll read in the book about a program called Nitro Zeus, a secret program that U.S. Cyber Command, which has just been elevated to higher status in the military, created to unplug all of Iran if we ended up going to war with them. The theory being that if you could turn the country off, you don't really need to bomb it. That's where we're headed in a world of new conflict. And that's something that artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all will make even more complex because they speed up the process and take human judgment out of the loop when you're trying to figure out how do you stop this escalation. Stopping escalation is a central question. When you get into the chapters about President Obama's struggle to figure out what to do about the Russians in the summer of 2016, in the middle of the election. Yes, he said to his aides who came to him with lists of things we could do to the Russians, we could cut them off from the world economy. We could reveal Vladimir Putin's billions that he's hidden around the world. We could mess up the finances of the oligarchs. But what if Putin escalates by coming back on election day and actually affecting the vote, registration systems, even just turning off the electric power in key districts? And it was the fear of that kept the Obama administration from acting against the Russians. And anyway, since they all knew Hillary was going to win, they figured they'd do some sanctions later and turn it over to her later on. We have the most sophisticated cyber weapons on Earth, and we're worried about using them because we can't control that ladder of escalation. Interestingly, our own intelligence agencies tried to convince Congress this wasn't an attack. It was just another form of espionage. Why did they take that position? Because they didn't want this categorized as an act of war or an attack, because we do it to everybody else as well. One of the biggest obstacles to setting these minimum standards of what we won't attack, I think, will be us, will be the United States. Just play this sort of thought experiment in your mind. Okay, you're the Secretary of State, and you're taking a brief moment from pulling your hair out about the Saudis, and you're writing up a memo to all of your fellow cabinet members saying, I'm going to go out and negotiate an international cyber accord. And so we have to think about the things that we're willing to give up attacking because we want to get everybody else to agree to give up attacking those. So we had a bunch of beers down in the State Department commissary, and we came up with a list. Nursing homes, hospitals, electric grid, election systems. This memo hits the NSA, the CIA, other intelligence agencies. I'm betting, based on fairly lengthy conversations with people who've lived in that world for a long time, that they would stop and say, wait a minute, do we really want to stop all meddling with election systems? Yeah, I know what Vladimir Putin did was really bad, but if you want to take this off the table for a president of the United States, you may be denying him or her the ability to stop a war before it happens. And after all, we meddled in the Italian elections in 1948, more Latin American elections in the 50s and 60s than I can count, the Japanese elections, the South Korean elections. We ran a coup in Iran. Thank you, Kermit Roosevelt. So it's not as if we haven't done this before, just in a pre-digital age. Turn off electric power systems? Well, I just told you before about Nitro Zeus, right? I'm sure that the CIA and Cyber Command and NSA would say, we may well have to go unplug a country rather than go to war with them. Wouldn't you prefer we do that? So I think it's going to be a really tough haul to get the U.S. to sign on.
Actually, the original rationale for cyber weapons was to avoid a shooting war.
That's right. That it would be better for civilians. And so far it has, because you can't really find civilians who have died because of a cyber attack. Sooner or later, this is going to happen because somebody will turn off electric power someplace, and you can imagine what will happen.
Or they'll have a self-driving car which would be guided by somebody in North Korea off a cliff.
That's right. And, talk about the psychological effects. The first time you read about somebody who got into their self-driving car to go to the supermarket and ended up going over that cliff, you're going to think twice about getting into your self-driving car, which is why the companies that are building this, Tesla, General Motors, others, are investing so much in the cybersecurity of the cars. Part of the difficulty we're suffering from here is this stuff seems technological and complex, And somehow it's still acceptable in the political world to say, oh, I don't understand all this cyber stuff if you're a senator or a congressman, but I asked my 13-year-old daughter to explain it to me. Back in the nuclear age, would it have been acceptable politically to say, oh, this nuclear stuff, it's nuclear physics? I asked my 13-year-old son or daughter to go explain it to me. That would have made somebody feel foolish if they said that about nuclear weapons. And yet it's acceptable in the cyber world because it makes you sort of a regular person to say, oh, this stuff's so complicated, I can barely use my computer. On the question of could somebody else shut down the United States, you may remember that back in the spring, the Department of Homeland Security turned out a warning about Russian-made malware that was throughout the American electric grid. These are called implants, and countries put implants in a system to either monitor it or be able to attack it later on. That would be something where you'd think early on, this is something we should ban in that Digital Geneva Convention. Except, wait a minute, we've put hundreds of thousands of implants in foreign computer systems around the world.
As in the Stuxnet virus, for instance.
Including Stuxnet, but also in Russian systems and North Korean systems and Iranian systems and the systems of some of our allies, right? And we say to them, oh, don't worry about it. We're the United States. We don't have any evil intent. The problem when you look at malware is you can't figure out the intent of the person who put it in. So we freak out when we see the Russian malware in our systems, but we expect everybody else to think of our malware as benign. This isn't going to work. The final question on Israeli cybersecurity firms. Israel's built up a very big cybersecurity economy because they grab kids early, figure out their math and programming skills, put them in Unit 8200, which is their equivalent of the NSA. They spend a few years of their military service in there. They do great work, including the Stuxnet virus, which they worked on with the United States. They then leave 8200 when they leave their military service, and they start these cybersecurity firms that are all around Unit 8200. You go to Unit 8200, which you can't miss because it's the only thing out that's next to the Mossad building, and it's got, antennas all over the place. And then around it are all these startup companies. Just as around Fort Meade in Maryland, we've got lots of cybersecurity firms. The ones that got in trouble that you were reading about were ones that were selling basically surveillance weapons to authoritarian governments and saying, we have no idea how this is being used. We've sold them a capability and told them to use it legally. It's sort of the gun manufacturer's argument. We sell the guns, we don't tell people how to use them, we expect them to use them within the law. And you're going to need a lot more transparency about who did what to whom. You think about the 4 different kind of vulnerabilities we have to cyber. They're sort of on a sliding scale, right? So we've got the vulnerability of espionage, but that's basically just ramping up what people used to do by reading each other's mail or tapping each other's phone. Then you've got the vulnerability of data manipulation. That one scares me much more. Espionage doesn't, because that is the possibility of changing votes, but it's also the possibility that somebody gets into the military's databases and changes the blood types of every soldier and sailor. And you can imagine the long-term damage of that. Or that you get in and change the targeting of a nuclear weapon or a non-nuclear weapon. And that's part of the difficulty when we do this to the North Koreans. We open ourselves up to people thinking that's fair game. Then there's the category of destroying actual things that happen, that run our lives. The utility grid, the phone system, those nuclear centrifuges. The final one, the most subtle one, is the information warfare side that we've been so obsessed with for the past 2 years. And that one is hard in particular because we're an open society. We want to have a lot of communication. If anybody here took out one of these ads themselves calling for secession in Texas or calling for, attacking the Black Lives Matter movement or some similar political movement, it would be within your First Amendment rights as an individual, but we want to ban it when foreign countries do it. And that means you've got to really know who the author was. And that's the core of Facebook's dilemma. The question of whether psychological warfare or whether or not an actual attack on infrastructure is the greatest fear. The nature of cyber attacks is if you're an attacker, You don't have to choose.
That's right.
You get to use them both. You can start with what you call psychological warfare, what Stalin called information warfare. In the American view of cyber, we always separated out the sort of physical attack stuff from the information warfare stuff. If you talk to Russians about this, they always looked at that and said, that's crazy. This is all part of the same. And that's, of course, exactly what we've seen Putin do. Albert, you talked about the entry cost of cyber being very low. It is. If you want nuclear weapons, you need uranium, plutonium, millions of dollars, infrastructure, reprocessing plants. If you're doing cyber weapons, you need some people the age of the students out here. You need some laptops. You need a little stolen data from the NSA. Fortunately, there's plenty of that that's downloadable. A case of Red Bull, that would be good, okay? And you're kind of good to go. Could a group like that create havoc and try to set country against country? Seems to me that's called the Internet Research Agency. They did a pretty good job of it. When I did the work on this book, what struck me was that in the cases that I sort of recited in here, Sony, OPM, the attacks on the State Department, the White House, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff by the Russians that preceded the attack on the Democratic National Committee, and to which we made the Russians pay no price at all, speaking of a failure of deterrence, they all had something in common, which is that we had a perfect intelligence record on them, which is to say we missed every single one of them. So on the election system, I'm less worried about the machines, with an exception that I will just describe. And I've had this same conversation with the people who you heard from this, John Brennan and others. I'm less worried about the machines than I am with everything that we surround it with. So the solution to the machine seems to be fairly basic. We should not allow voting machines of any kind to be used in the United States that do not have a paper backup. There are 14 states that have at least partial no paper backup. There are 5 states that have none whatsoever.
Yeah.
Okay? And that seems to me to be inexcusable, because you can go off and do an electronic election as long as you've got something, even if it takes you weeks to sort it out, you've got a way to go sort it out. And I think that's pretty critical. I worry less about the machines on election day than the day before the election, when somebody programs those machines with the ballot. And while everybody will tell you that the election machines are not online, and they are not, the programming that ultimately goes into those machines is online. The other thing that's online is the registration system, right? Because that's got to be outwardly facing. And that's what the Russians were probing in 2016. They weren't going after the machines, they were going after the registration system. So that if Warren showed up at his precinct and they said, gee, this is very nice, Mr. Hogue, but we understand that you have moved back to London. And you say, well, no, actually, I'm still right here. Eventually, it would get sorted out, but the fact of the matter is it would make a lot of people wonder if their vote got counted. Estonia, that it couldn't be hacked or would be less likely to be hacked, it was hacked by the Russians in 2007. In fact, that was one of the original sins of cyber conflict. We thought 10 or 15 years ago that the internet was a blessing to democracy around the world. I was White House correspondent at the end of Bill Clinton's time in office, and we would go to Beijing, and he would go to Beida, Beijing University, and he'd give these great speeches where, while he phrased it politely, basically said, the internet will be the end of the Communist Party in China, because as a rising middle class comes up, demands more freedom, gets more information, the party will crack apart. The height of this analysis was the Arab Spring, when we saw kids going out into Tahrir Square, organizing protests over Twitter and Facebook messages, and we thought, wow, what a democratizing capability. And now for the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen the backlash, because Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and everybody else, every other authoritarian on earth has said, we know how to go use this as well, as an instrument of surveillance, as a way of tracking down dissidents. I mean, Facebook is an authoritarian's dream. I keep on my desk, and did during the time I was writing this book, a book that Henry Kissinger wrote in 1957 called Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. And it was an effort by Kissinger to sort of lay out for a public audience how you would deter the use of nuclear weapons. Now, he came up with some suggestions that today he might not sign on to, including the possibility of using limited nuclear war. In fact, we know he hasn't signed on to those since. But it was a laudable first effort. And we now have the beginnings of efforts at Stanford, at Harvard, at MIT, at the University of Chicago, down in Texas, of different cyber centers trying to figure out the deterrence problem. But we haven't gotten there yet because we haven't quite figured out what do you do with the attack that looks like it came from a state, but maybe didn't. In the voting system, we are saved by the fact that our state-by-state voting system is so disparate, so backward, so crazy, that no one can figure it out, including the Russians, okay? And this is our greatest protection. The most vulnerable country would be, say, the European countries that mandate we all use the same kind of electronic voting machines and we use them nationwide.